Okay, so let's get started. Thank you everyone for joining us for our Adirondack Research Consortium and Paul Smith College webinar series. This fall's series is called Impacts, Threats, and Opportunities. I'm Mel Johnson, and I'm president of Adirondack Research Consortium and a professor at Paul Smith College. We'd like to thank all of the speakers in the whole series, and I'm going to hand off to David Miller, who is the on the Adirondack Research Consortium board and works at Adirondack Council. So Dave will be our moderator for today, and I'm going to hand off to Dave. Thanks, Dave.
Well, thank you, Mel, and thank you everybody for joining us. This is an exciting and the fifth series of seminars that ARC's been doing. And I just want to thank Paul Smith College for all their support and all their efforts, and Mel and Dan, and really doing the work to put all these programs together. Also, I want to thank our sponsors. Sponsor today is the Adirondack Council. And thank them for sponsoring this webinar on wildlife and connectivity in the age of climate change, and thank the Council for all their work for the Adirondack Park. This session is also dedicated and in the honor of the memory of Bill Porter, a wildlife champion so many of us knew and so many of us loved. So we really want to send a shout out to all in memory of Bill. So today we have Michale Glennon and John Davis. I'm going to introduce both of them right now, and then step aside, and we're going to hear the wonderful presentations they have put together. Michale Glennon is the science director of the Paul Smith College Adirondack Watershed Institute. She's interested in the effects of land use management on wildlife populations in the Adirondacks, and is engaged in research ranging from issues of residential development to recreational ecology to climate change and more. She's an ecologist and previously spent 15 years as a director of science for the Adirondack program of the Wildlife Conservation Society. At AWI, Michale works to support and help shape the scientific research programs, provide high quality research opportunities for students, which is so important, and distribute and champion the work in order to enhance the use of science in the management and stewardship of the natural resources of the Adirondack Park. So glad that you're here and presenting today with your incredible expertise. And John Davis, who will follow Michale, is the rewilding advocate for the Adirondack Council and executive director of the Rewilding Institute. He also works with land trusts to secure critical habitat links in the Adirondack Park and beyond, and particularly Split Rock Wildway and the Adirondacks to Algonquin A2A axis. John has had decades of experience on these issues, and it's a real pleasure and honor to have him with us also today. So I'll turn it over to our two panelists, and then we will have the opportunity for questions. At the end, we're going to use Mel, the chat, to do that as we move forward. And let's go to a very exciting program today. And thank you both again.
And before, Michale, before you start, if I could ask everyone, if you have questions that you would like moderated, please put those in Q&A, and I'll make sure that Michale and John get them. If you want to just say hi or something, you can use chat for that, but we will not be moderating the chat. Thank you.
How's it look? See my screen? All right. Well, thanks so much. And I'm so excited to be here, just looking at the list of participants. I said to Mel before we let everybody in that this is my favorite crowd. It's all my friends that are on here. So I'm happy to be here. And I do want to mention that the work that I'll talk about is work that I started primarily with WCS and have brought with me and continue to work on here at AWI, but it really does go all the way back to being a grad student under Bill Porter, who I miss so very much. So I appreciate the dedication to him, and I hope we all take a moment to remember him and his legacy in the park. And I'm also incredibly happy to be here sharing the time with John, who's one of my favorite champions. And we'll start with me, and I will sort of give a picture of connectivity and wildlife that's a little bit, I suspect, on the small scale compared to what John will talk about. So hopefully, I'm going to talk about little critters and smaller scale stuff, and then John will probably wow you with the big charismatic stuff that maybe people get more excited about. So probably a good order to begin with. But I do want to set the stage for a minute by just mentioning that, you know, we should reflect for a minute that, you know, one of the challenges I think about talking about connectivity in the Adirondacks is just that we look pretty good compared to, you know, certainly the rest of the Eastern North American continent. We are, by almost any measure and any sort of set of statistics that you pull, you know, we are a more connected landscape. We have higher ecological integrity. We are more resilient. We're pretty highly regulated and less developed. And for that reason, I think we're in better shape to contend with incredibly important threats like climate change than lots and lots and lots of places. So I just want to reflect on that and recognize the incredible value that we have in this park, which comes from this interconnected fabric of protected state lands and highly important private lands as well. But I want to sort of take you in a little bit, zoom into the landscape and think about and recognize what connectivity means sort of within this big fabric of the park when we look at it a little more closely. So it's a very scalable issue, and it's a very context-dependent issue. Thinking about the park at the 30,000-foot view, or standing and, you know, flying over it, or standing on top of any mountain, we sort of see this amazing green blanket that reflects the intactness of our forest. But when we zoom in a bit, in this case into the Saranac Lake area, we can see sort of the legacy of the 130,000 residents that live in this park and the millions of people that visit this park every year. And of course, all of whom need the roads and the infrastructure and the development that enables us to make a living here and recreate here and do all the things that we want to do. And my work has been primarily focused on some of those kind of interior forces of fragmentation and how they impact connectivity for wildlife in the Adirondacks. This is a zoomed in spot right in the lower right-hand corner there that I've worked in Saranac Lake. It's just one example of sort of the type of development that can present a challenge for connectivity in the backcountry areas of the Adirondacks. So one of the things you learn when you first start to sort of, you know, consult the textbooks or talk to somebody who works on ecological connectivity, the first thing you're going to get back as a reaction is, well, connectivity for what? Connectivity is sort of very dependent on the species or the critter that you're interested in talking about. And so I put this slide here just kind of to illustrate that concept, that it means different things for different types of species. And most of my work has been focused more on the smaller species, but it sort of varies a lot. So we know that in a place, you know, like this particular development outside of Saranac Lake, you know, from the 30,000-foot view, looks pretty intact. It looks pretty highly forested, but there are roads in there and there are houses in there. And depending on which wildlife species we might be focused on, the relative impact might be different. A bear, for example, a moose, for example, a large kind of generalist type of critter might wander right through there and not be too impeded by certain styles of development like that. Maybe a marten, on the other hand, though, who doesn't particularly like being nearby to human infrastructure and development, might avoid that area entirely. And finally, something like a scarlet tanager or some of our other songbirds who depend on large intact forest blocks might see it totally differently. They might instead see, you know, an independent patches of woods which may or may not be big enough to support high reproductive success for those species. So this is just to remind you that sort of it really depends on which species you're focused on. I have spent a lot of time for the past 20 years, if you count going back to work I did with Bill at ESF, looking at one particular sort of force of fragmentation in the Adirondacks. Fragmentation, of course, being kind of the flip side of connectivity. And that is this sort of low density residential development, or rural sprawl, if you want to call it that. We often call it exurban development. And we have spent a lot of time, my colleague Heidi Kretzer and I have done all this work together, my colleagues, my former colleagues at WCS, engaged in you know, a whole series of studies in the most in the Adirondacks, but some actually also in other landscapes, to ask questions about sort of what the impacts to wildlife are as a result of this sort of backcountry development. This isn't, you know, development in the middle of town. It's really sort of large lot size, long driveways, and somewhat hidden until you either fly over it or drive in some of these landscapes. A little bit hard to see. And I'm really sort of bastardizing 15 years of science by reducing it to a couple of slides for you. But these are just some of the questions that we've investigated over time and some of the things that we've learned. And I'm going to drill in on some of these. But if I had the opportunity to sort of condense the lessons that have come out from a lot of this research, these would be what we have learned. One is that the size of the impact is bigger than just the physical footprint, and I'm going to elaborate on that a little bit. It is a result not just of the physical infrastructure, the houses and the roads, it's also resulting from a variety of disturbances that come along with those features on the landscape. So some of them are tangible and easy to imagine, and some of them are less so, like lights or noise kind of disturbances that we can't see, but that do impact wildlife. We can see changes in wildlife communities very rapidly after development occurs. We certainly are not driving everybody away. Some species we are attracting, and that brings in a whole different set of circumstances and community changes. And we do see some consistency in patterns, both across taxa and across systems. We've had the opportunity to work in not only here in the park, but also in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And we see some consistencies among the way that species respond, despite these really, really different geographies. And the most prevalent thing that we see, and again, I'll elaborate on this, is ecosystem simplification. So I want to talk about those two bullets, the first one and the last one, because I think they're the most tightly connected to what we're talking about today. So this notion of what we call the ecological effect zone, other researchers have given it other titles. Heidi and I have referred to it as the ecological effect zone, but this is basically sort of, how far away do you have to go from a house or from a road to find a wildlife community that essentially looks the same as if that feature was not present on the landscape. And we have found here in the Adirondacks with regard to songbird communities that up to 200 meters away from a house in this case, and we found similar distance with regard to roads, things are just different. It's a different biological community. And if you do your sort of high school pi r squared math, that's 30 acres. It's not trivial. Similar work has been done with small mammals in the Adirondacks by another of Bill Porter's students in 2008, and she found kind of a similar distance effect. But you can go in the literature and look at people who have asked these kinds of questions for systems all over the world with all different kinds of critters, and you can find sort of ecological effect zones or house distance effects that range from as little as 50 meters to, getting up into kilometers for certain kinds of salamanders and amphibians. So it really is, again, scale dependent and dependent on the types of species that you're interested in. And we have seen some consistency around that 200-meter range in the Adirondacks. This is just a graphic that I have used over and over again because it illustrates kind of the interplay of how that distance effect works together with where we choose to put stuff on the landscape, which is really, really important. So this is work that Dave Theobald did a number of years ago, but imagine that each of those red dots is a house. Imagine that the blue circles represents an effect zone of 100 meters. Maybe it's that. Imagine that instead it's that yellow zone. It's going to differ depending on a variety of characteristics. But in any case, you can see that how we choose to sort of arrange roads and houses within undeveloped landscapes affects the degree to which those sort of zones of disturbance to wildlife overlap or don't. And this is why I've been arguing for years and years about the idea of clustered development, or if you don't like that terminology, putting the development sort of so that you're overlapping those ecological zones of impact, which then leaves the rest of your landscape, free outside of that development zone. So that's one concept, is that the size of the impact is bigger than just the infrastructure. The other take home that I want you to understand from the accumulated research, not just of us, but of other scientists as well, is this pattern of ecosystem simplification. So we have seen this with exurban development in the Adirondacks and elsewhere, as have other scientists. We've also seen it with urban development. And that is that in the case of songbirds here, we tend to, as we add houses onto the landscape, we tend to replace certain kinds of species with other kinds of species. So for us here, we replace the sensitive ones with the human adapted species. We tend to favor omnivores over insectivores. We tend to benefit resident birds over migrant birds. We tend to benefit generalist birds over birds that are sort of more obligate forest birds. And the reason why any of this is a problem and something we need to be cognizant of is that we tend to favor a few winners over many losers. We tend, most species are not super common, and large numbers of species that are less common lose out to a few that are more common and really, really well adapted to humanity. If you want a $10 word to describe this process, you can refer to biotic homogenization. But there's analogs to this within our human communities that I'm sure all of you can relate to. Think about driving on the outskirts of Burlington or Cleveland or Buffalo. You know that somewhere there's going to be a strip that looks the same as anywhere else that you go in any of those cities, where there's a Lowe's and there's a Home Depot and there's a Walmart, all those big box stores. And you can also almost kind of replace the background. It's the geography of nowhere. It's everything that looks the same. This is the analog of that within biological communities, where we favor a couple of species that are cosmopolitan and really, really good at exploiting a whole variety of different environments at the cost of, the regional specialties, the icons of our region in many cases. That's the phenomenon of biotic homogenization. And we see it in association, not just with development of the type that I've studied in the Adirondacks, but we also see it as a result of things like climate change. Speaking of climate change, I'm now going to shift us entirely to talk about a different set of birds and sort of bring climate into this discussion and do my best to explain how it integrates with what I've just been talking about. So we have in the Adirondacks a bunch of Canadian bird friends. If you plot their distribution, they look like that graphic in the top left-hand corner of the screen. That is the geography of the Boreal zone, at least within North America. And the Adirondack Park sits right on sort of the transition between the temperate zone and the Boreal zone. And what that means is that most of our park is a northern hardwood forest system, but we have little pockets of magical places like Spring Pond Bog in this picture, in which live these northern species. These are widespread in the Canadian Boreal, and they just happen to be kind of at the southern range extent in the park, in the southern part of where they breed. And I've been tracking them for a large number of years. These are just some of the examples of those species that live in these peatland, sphagnum, wonderful boreal habitats that are adapted to being cold and wet and adapted to northern kinds of disturbance processes. We've been monitoring them in about 60 locations throughout the park, going back 15 plus years, and just sort of looking at changes in these communities over time. And here's another biological concept that I'm going to give you today to illustrate what connectivity means in the context of these particular birds. So this is the notion of metapopulations. And you can think about this not just for my boreal birds, but for any sort of species that lives in a discrete, patchy kind of habitat. So think about vernal pool amphibians. For these birds, they don't live throughout the temperate forest, northern hardwood forest, but they live in these pockets of boreal forest within it. For populations that operate this way, we have what are called source habitats. They're big and robust and resilient, and they tend to have more individuals. And then we have sink habitats, which are smaller, tend to be more isolated, not as good. There's more individuals generally in the sources than there are in the sinks. They are maintained by births and deaths and immigration and emigration between them. The whole thing only works because there is travel between these different patches and because there are small patches and large patches, but they have to be connected. We can't fit everybody just into the source habitat or just into one source habitat. It's very much a network that relies on individuals being able to travel and sort of export to new habitats. So that's the context of these boreal birds in the Adirondack Park and other organisms as well. We've been tracking them for a number of years. This is unfortunately what the trends look like in the park for a decade or so. I'm just about to go through and do the 15-year update of these numbers, but with the exception of the palm warbler, unfortunately, most of them are facing a downward trajectory. Canada jay is doing okay. This is not surprising. I'm not the only person to see this. It's not being seen only in the Adirondacks. The phenomenon of sort of northern high latitude species retreating to the north, retreating either up in elevation or in latitude as a result of climate change has been documented in many, many places with many species. So I'm certainly not the only person to see that. But we've been trying to understand what the drivers of those trends are in the Adirondacks and sort of what the places are that might be most important to us and we might want to focus the most on because they're holding on to these birds longer than other ones are. So together with some of my favorite Boreal geek friends, we've been tracking them for a long time. And we've been able to identify some important patterns in the findings. One is that persistence is higher, not surprisingly, in bigger wetlands. Bigger wetlands hold more species than smaller ones. That's sort of kind of basic island biogeography. But also the ones that are more connected. So if you have a big boreal wetland that has other boreal habitat nearby, you're more likely to have these species and to hang on to these species, especially if those areas have relatively low human footprint, low proximity of infrastructure like roads and development nearby. All of these patterns are mediated as well by temperature and precipitation. Those things are very, very important to birds. They themselves are not super sensitive to just the fact that it's warmer because they're small and warmer temperatures can benefit survivorship, for example, of fledglings, but they are sensitive to precipitation and cold temperatures. And certainly, as the climate warms, unfortunately, combination of that and some dry conditions can actually take their habitats and eventually cause them to not be bogs anymore and turn into forests. So there's broader scale patterns at work, but we know climate change as well as human footprint are really important in explaining the drivers that we see. So here's where I'm gonna perform a magical feat of getting you to understand how these two disparate things I've been talking about actually come together. And that is to remind you that, one pattern that we see in the context of development in our landscape and elsewhere is this notion of, simplification. We're driving the system toward a few pretty cosmopolitan and common species. The other context is that these species, in the case of my boreal birds, operate in this metapopulation structure. We are fortunate in the Adirondacks that the source habitats are pretty well protected. Places like Spring Pond Bog, Massaweepy Mire, Madawaska, the Osgood Muskeg, these are kind of the charismatic megabogs that the birding community knows about and loves to go and travel through and look for these birds. And we've done a good job of getting those into state hands or easements or protected by the land trust, for example, in the Adirondacks. But most wetlands are not big. Spring Pond Bog and those types of places are the exception. They are the rarity and incredibly important, but most wetlands are small. Most wetlands are isolated. Here's some examples from right around the area of Saranac Lake. Again, think about, Lake Colby Bog that's sandwiched in between a road and a railroad. Think about the pond behind the high school in Saranac Lake, where we find some of these birds. It's right in the middle of all kinds of infrastructure. Think about the wetland that you drive through when you drive between Raybrook and Saranac Lake that, again, some of these birds are in there, but it's got a road going right through the middle of it. This is more characteristic of the vast majority of wetlands, not just boreal wetlands, but here's some examples of boreal wetlands in the park. By the way, a significant component of these boreal wetlands that I've worked in for a number of years are floating on the edges of our lakes and rivers. Osita has spectacular, absolutely beautiful wetland habitat for these birds. You could say that maybe that confers a little bit of protection because, there's not roads, but there are houses all around that lake. There are also a bazillion speedboats going around in the lake all the time. One of those peatlands on the edge has a water ski course right next to it. I don't know if that bothers the bird or not, but there's certainly, this is sort of more characteristic of where most of our wetlands are, and most of the birds, just because most of the wetlands are small, are in these more isolated places. So if we know that most wetlands are small, and we know that those smaller, more isolated wetlands are more vulnerable to being near roads, to being near infrastructure, to being impacted by proximate development, and we know that both that development and climate change can both cause this sort of phenomenon of simplification or homogenization, we know that our specialized species are more vulnerable. then, for example, my boreal birds are the very kind of birds that are particularly at risk. This is what happens when, my gray jay is competing with the blue jay that came along when we created the development. It's what happens when my rusty blackbird, which we hardly have any left of at all, has to all of a sudden compete with a whole bunch of red-winged blackbirds, or my boreal chickadee has to compete with a whole bunch of black-capped chickadees. Not that we don't love blue jays and black-capped chickadees and red-winged blackbirds, but nobody comes to the Adirondacks to see blue jays because we have them all over the East Coast. They come here to see gray jays. So this is sort of the place where these two things and these two areas of research come together and illustrate the interplay of climate change and connectivity, and the very kinds of species that are going to be sensitive to these sorts of patterns. So I'll just end by saying that, as a reminder, the Adirondack Park has some characteristics that make it better suited to deal with climate change than lots and lots of other places. But for some species, there are still very important issues to worry about. And there's lots of science out there that can help us with this. I'll just end by mentioning that we have written extensively about this, and the Adirondack program of WCS no longer exists, but all these resources still exist. You can get them on the internet. I will point them to you. They have permanent DOIs, and they're all still available as tools. You can email me, and we've got tools for how to think about this stuff sort of on smaller scales within the Adirondacks. And now I'm going to turn it over to John, who I think is probably going to take us far beyond the Adirondacks and talk about much bigger critters that are probably more interesting than my songbirds.
Thank you, Michale, although I would object to that last statement. I think your boreal songbirds are wonderful, and I always love seeing gray jays and rusty blackbirds and the like. And I want you to teach me how to make the creatures on the slides move. That's really impressive. I just know how they move on the land, but not on slides. So Melanie, thank you for rescuing me from my usual technical incompetence. I'm going to let you direct the slides, and I'll let you know when I want you to switch them on. So following on Michale's wonderful presentation there, I'm going to take it to a larger scale a bit here. And I want to recognize at the beginning that some of my presentation draws quite heavily from my friend and mentor, Dave Foreman, who passed away a couple of weeks ago. We've lost yet another giant in conservation, unfortunately. So Dave Foreman did this map, this North American Wildways map, many years ago with Kurt Menke. It's just an attempt to show, if we are to conserve and reconnect wildlife habitats across North America, where may be the priority regions. In putting together this map, Dave Foreman was not at all suggesting that we ignore the Midwest or the Great Plains. And in fact, some of us have since this map proposed that we add a Great Plains wildway and a Gulf Coast wildway. But Dave Foreman suggested that for wide-ranging species, and this does not nearly so much address some of the smaller animals and plants with limited ranges. But if you want to think about the big wide-ranging animals, the shy, sensitive, and wide-ranging animals, and I count myself as one of those, then focusing a good bit of attention on what Dave called the Eastern or the Appalachian Adirondack Acadian Wildway, where we are, and also on the Arctic Boreal Wildway across Canada and Alaska, and then the Spine of the Continent Wildway across the Rocky Mountains and adjacent grasslands and deserts, and the Pacific Crest and Coast Wildway, makes a great deal of sense. If we were to actually reconnect habitats through these continental wildways, continental scale wildlife corridors, we'd go a long way toward addressing the loss of biodiversity in North America. This would not be sufficient, but it would be a very good start. So the premise of rewilding, my title at Adirondack Council is Rewilding Advocate. The premise of rewilding is that we need to protect big, wild, connected places, and as much as possible, protect and restore the full range of species within them, including the top carnivores and other keystone species, which have disproportionate importance. Next, Bill. So this map shows what connectivity in our greater bioregion might look like. And I want to say at the outset, you'll see the Adirondack Park in the middle. This is not a map of proposed land acquisitions. It is not a map showing existing protected areas or existing public lands. Many of in this map, the yellow represents proposed wildlife corridors, the green proposed wild cores. all of these wild cores have roads, have towns, have many people. Nobody at the Rewilding Institute or Wildlands Network or elsewhere is calling for removal of people from these areas. It's just an attempt to show what is especially important for wide-ranging animals. The way I like to look at this map is, if I were a bear or a fisher or a bobcat or perhaps an eagle or an American eel or a brook trout, these lands and the waters within them are relatively safe places for my family and me if I'm a wide-ranging critter. So just to look at this map a little more carefully, the wildways especially important to Adirondack Park are let's start on the northeast. That yellow stripe on the northeast of the Adirondack Park, I think that's along the Chazy River and surrounding areas. All rivers are very, very important ecologically, and one of the best things we can do for habitat connectivity is, wherever possible, protect and buffer waterways, especially free-flowing streams and rivers and lakes wherever possible. Coming down a little farther south, you see along the edge with Lake Champlain, Split Rock Wildway, a wildlife corridor linking Lake Champlain and the West Champlain Hills with the high peaks to the west. Come down a little farther, so we're in the southeast part of Adirondack Park. There's the connection to the Green Mountains. So the southern Lake Champlain Valley connection between the Adirondack Mountains and the Green Mountains in Vermont is critically important, and several land trusts are working on that. The most tenuous connections of highest value and importance around Adirondack Park, in my view, are those down to the southward to the Catskills. Some folks, including I think our friends at Adirondack Land Trust, know that that area is the Mohawk link, and obviously the Mohawk, I-90 especially, and the Mohawk, the heavy development along the Mohawk River represents a real challenge for wildlife movement. But I think most scientists would agree it's very important to keep New York's great Catskill Park connected to New York's great Adirondack Park, north-south or south-north connection. Then moving a little farther west to the southwestern part of Adirondack Park, critical habit, yes, right there, critical connection across the Black River Valley to Tug Hill Plateau. So that's the Adirondack to Tug Hill connection, represented also in that next yellow swath up. And then going to the northwest quadrant of Adirondack Park, yes, that broad area, that's basically the Adirondack to Algonquin or A to A axis. And I view that as important. I've done a lot of wandering around the wild parts of North America. And even though I've explored a great many other regions, I see this as being as important as any habitat connection or wildway in the country. The connection between our beloved Adirondack Park, northwestward to Ontario's Algonquin Park, and Adirondack Council and many other groups work with the A2A Conservation Collaborative to try to keep that region as intact as possible. And we will benefit from greater land trust involvement, greater state leadership, and we hope strong incentives for private lands conservation in A2A and in all of these wildways. I want to emphasize these wildlife corridors will only be kept intact if we make it affordable and even, I hope, profitable for landowners to practice good stewardship, to use wildlife friendly practices. We really need stronger incentives for private lands conservation. Next. So as I mentioned, I've done a lot of, I'm not a degreed scientist. I wish I were, but I do a lot of scouting, particularly in what I see as wildways from the local to the regional to the continental level. And I was fortunate in 2011 to essentially take a year off from work. I had a great job at Adirondack Council, but I wanted to see some of these wild places that I've been talking and writing about. So I took some time off and started scouting the proposed Appalachian Adirondack Atlantic Wildway. This book was the result of that. I think my dear friend Jerry Jenkins, a biologist who many of you know, took this photo on the Allagash Waterway in northern Maine. But this book, if any of you were interested in seeing what I observed as I was scouting the proposed Appalachian Atlantic Adirondack Wildway, this book sort of summarizes that. And I I came away quite optimistic, guardedly optimistic from that trek. I was taking the trek, trying to imagine myself a panther or a puma, cougar, all the same animal, trying somehow miraculously, really not as an individual probably, but as a lineage of great cats, to make the long trek from southern Florida, where there is a small remnant population of panthers, up into our region. So I was trying to look at the landscape through the eyes of a puma, and I found that actually a lot of it is still intact. This is just a simple forest cover map. And you see in our region, we have a lot of dark green, thank goodness, and the most solid block of that dark green is our beloved Adirondack Park. But you see as well that there is a good bit of green, connected green across the eastern United States. If you were to zoom in, you would see there's also, of course, a great deal of fragmentation, especially along the coast, and yeah, particularly along the coast. Because one thing I found is that the Piedmont of the Appalachians is actually less, excuse me, the southern coastal plain is actually less fragmented than the Piedmont in some areas, because the Piedmont is very developable. And I think that there's a lesson in that. So oftentimes foothills are very vulnerable to development. They afford good potential development sites, and we have to, I think, pay special attention to keep intact our foothills as well as our floodplains. Next. So I'm one of the wildlife corridors to which I give special attention, because I live here, is Split Rock Wildway. Again, I mentioned that's the habitat connection from Lake Champlain westward into the high peaks. Referring again to my mentor, the late great Dave Foreman, he would say that putting together implementing a wildlands network design is a bit like putting together a jigsaw puzzle. Some people need to have the whole picture in mind and know what piece needs to go where and when it might go. Many of the players involved will be focused on a single piece or two pieces, and will be working hard to get those pieces in place. So in thinking about protecting a wildlife corridor, you have to think parcel by parcel. You have to talk with many, many different landowners. You have to think about how to protect through conservation easement or voluntary agreement, or in some case, land trust acquisition, in some cases, perhaps state acquisition. You have to think about how to protect the swath of wild habitat piece by piece. Thankfully, in Split Rock Wildway, we've had participation from several land trusts, including Adirondack Land Trust and Northeast Wilderness Trust and Champlain Area Trails. And by my estimate, we need about 15,000 acres of contiguous forest to have an intact wildlife corridor here, and we've protected about that. State gets a lot of the credit too. The biggest single protected area in this, shown in yellow here on the lake, is Split Rock Wild Forest. Next. As many conservation biologists have pointed out, and Dave Foreman always emphasized, roads are probably the single biggest threat to wildlife in many areas, including locally here in Split Rock Wildway. This is a dead timber rattlesnake on Lakeshore Road, all too common a sight. I see almost as many dead timber rattlesnakes next to Split Rock Wild Forest as I see living ones within the wild forest. Roads are we all use them. I came down here by road today. We all use roads almost daily, but for many animals, they may actually block movement, or perhaps more often they directly kill animals as they try to cross the road. There are solutions to this tragedy, including carefully designed and carefully placed overpasses and underpasses. And I strongly believe that New York State and all states should do much, much more to provide safe wildlife crossings on busy roads. And there will be increasing opportunities for this with some of the infrastructure money that's coming along. Next. Again, I want to emphasize the importance of waterways. Everywhere we possibly can protect and restore intact floodplain forests, we should. This is a surprisingly intact floodplain forest protected by Adirondack Nature Conservancy and the very conservation-minded Payne family near Willsboro. This is near the mouth of the Boquet River, and a rare example of a relatively intact floodplain forest, which, thank goodness, and thanks to our friends, some of whom are on this meeting, it is protected. Next. Here's just a very simple core scale map of the A to A axis, the Adirondack to Algonquin connection. Again, I think this is a continentally important wildlife corridor. Probably, some animals don't really like to cross large bodies of water. And if you think about an animal trying to move northward from Adirondack Park, probably one of the safest ways for them to be able to move northward, really northwestward, as you can see, is across the Thousand Islands. They are like stepping stones and do make it a little bit easier for animals to get across the river. Of course, the greatest impediments to movement in the 8A corridor are roads, especially near the US border, but on the Canadian side, the 401, for instance. We desperately need to get safe wildlife crossings on the busy roads on the Canadian side and also on our side, although the road density is not quite as great on our side, ironically. Next. 8A was inspired in part by a moose named Alice. She was actually released near the SUNY facility in Newcomb and made her way northwest gradually and ended her life or spent her final years in Algonquin Park. And she basically traced the route that biologists had already identified as the least cost path for wide-ranging animal dispersal. So she became something of an icon for the Algonquin to Adirondack connection. This moose I got on a wildlife camera on a conserved land owned by Eddy Foundation west of Port Henry. But moose are a comeback success as well. They were extirpated from our region and recolonized a few decades ago, and their numbers have they may have plateaued, we don't know, but their numbers have grown considerably since when they first recolonized. I think there's estimated to be 700 or so in northern New York now. Beautiful, wide-ranging animal that benefits from habitat connections. Next. This is sort of a typical example of the scenery you see in the Algonquin to Adirondack corridor, the 8A axis. This is a marvelous area not well known in the northwestern part of Adirondack Park called Gulf Stream, as if it were off the coast of the Atlantic Gulf Stream, but a beautiful wild part of the park and quite typical in habitat. And again, underscoring the importance of waterways as well as land protection. Next. Another rewilding success story, you might say, another wildlife comeback is beavers. Beavers are thriving in our area after past exploitation, thriving to the point where sometimes they end up being a bit of a nuisance for people, but I always urge people to learn to coexist with beavers. They are really a keystone species, as important ecologically as any animal around for the wetlands they create and the attenuation of floodwaters and the wonderful diverse habitats they create. Next. These photos, by the way, are from wildlife cameras that I have put up in Split Rock Wildway. This is a fisher, another wildlife comeback story. Fishers were pretty much eliminated from our region decades ago. I believe they were actively reintroduced. I should look that up. I think they were actively reintroduced. I think I saw Joe Rissette's name in the list. Joe, correct me if I'm wrong about that. But in any case, fishers are thriving now. They are an interior forest animal and will benefit from our maintaining wildlife habitat connections through the region. And one of the few animals that effectively eats porcupines. So if you get annoyed by all the porcupines around your camp, be glad for fishers. Next. So this is our largest canid, largest dog family member in viable numbers, Eastern Coyote. The Eastern Coyote story is long and complicated. I won't go into it, there's no time, but I will say coyotes, in my view, they do have wolf genes here. They interbred with wolves as they came from the West. Maybe as much as 30% wolf genetic material in some coyotes in our region. They are decidedly bigger than Western coyotes. They do occasionally hunt in packs. They do exhibit some wolf-like behavior, I believe, but they're not fully playing the role of wolves. If we are fortunate enough to have a strong and perhaps even growing moose population, ultimately those moose, in my opinion, would need wolves as their predator to hold their numbers in check and to keep them more healthy. Coyotes, so far as I have heard, do not prey on full-grown moose, maybe occasionally a calf, likely would scavenge on moose carcasses. But that's a basic difference between coyotes and wolves. Coyotes are very quick to scavenge. They do hunt, of course, but they are really much more of a scavenging animal than our wolves. Wolves really truly are a keystone predator. Thank you. Next. This is a photo I took when I was visiting years ago the Red Wolf Captive Facility in the Albemarle Peninsula of eastern North Carolina. The only breeding population of wolves we have in the eastern United States at this point, so far as is known, is in that part of that big peninsula on the east coast of North Carolina. The red wolf is, again, there are debates about what what large canids we should have here in the Northeast. It's possible we had red wolves and gray wolves here. It doesn't seem to be entirely clear about that, I think, but the point is large canids are valuable top predators who help keep prey species, particularly ungulates, in balance. Unfortunately, there are lessons in any effort we might eventually make toward wolf recovery in the Northeast from the red wolf recovery effort in the Southeast, which was biologically has done well, but socially there's been a lot of resistance, sometimes drummed up by developers who want to open up habitats for denser development. There will need, if we are to restore our top carnivores in the Northeast, as I urgently hope, we will need to do a lot of education and build very, very strong public support so that the animals can thrive. Next. One of my favorite animals, actually on my land, Hemlock Rock Wildlife Sanctuary and Spit Rock Wildway. This is a bobcat. Bobcats are another wildlife comeback story. They were badly diminished in decades past and now are thriving. And most of these animals that are wide-ranging benefit from wildlife corridors, benefit from wilderness, but they can tolerate some human presence. Very rare are the species that are completely intolerant of humans. The closest thing in terms of mammals to that would probably be the wolverine. They may have been here in Adirondack Park. They were extirpated. They seem to be almost fully wilderness dependent, but most of our wide-ranging animals, if we can learn to coexist with them, if we will accept their presence, they usually do okay. Next. This ugly photo is to make the point that if we can afford to put in pedestrian crossings to give access to McDonald's over I-90, we can surely do that for wildlife too. As you probably all noticed driving on I-90 across New York, there are several of these pedestrian crossings that give access to fast food places. We can surely do that for wildlife as too. Not in the same places, of course, but the point is we can build these structures for wild animals as well as for people. Next. We are extremely fortunate here in Adirondack Park to have abundant old growth forest, perhaps as much as 500,000 acres of forest in Adirondack Park escaped logging, or at least escaped heavy logging. And this is important habitat for some shy, sensitive, and wide-ranging species, and some narrow, possibly even some endemic species. We don't know enough to say that for certain. If any of you are interested in learning about old growth forest in the eastern United States, I'd urge you to look up the Old Growth Forest Network, which was started by Joan Maloof, shown here in the forest, in the photograph, the Old Growth Forest Network, who also serves on the Eddy Foundation board, helping protect Split Rock Wildway. Next. Cannot underscore the importance of waterways again, and when we're thinking about habitat connectivity, it's also about fish and other aquatic wildlife, not just about wide-ranging mammals. One of the goals we have at Adirondack Council is to see whether here in Adirondack Park there may be some obsolete dams that perhaps could be removed with local support to restore free-flowing waters and benefit brook trout and American eel and other animals, other diadromous. Well, brook trout are not so. Wide-ranging or diadromous fish would benefit from strategic dam removals of unneeded obsolete dams. So think about fish as well as wide-ranging mammals when you think about habitat connections. Next. And think about plants too. This is a photograph by our friend Jerry Jenkins, who directs the Northern Forest Atlas project. If any of you have not gone to northernforestatlas.org, I urge you to do so. You'll see some of the most spectacular botanical photography anywhere, and you will gain a much better understanding of our natural communities, especially the plant component of our natural communities. Rewilding is about plants too. We really have to think, or conservation in general is very much about plants. We really have to think carefully about what are the threats to our native trees. Forest pests and pathogens are one of the greatest threats to the ecological integrity and wild character of Adirondack Park. So we really need to think about pests and pathogens and how to keep them out. And it tends to be the case that the areas most resistant to invasion by exotic species are big, unfragmented habitats. So the big road-free areas, especially the wilderness areas on the Forest Preserve in Adirondack Park, may have the best chance of escaping the scourge of forest pests and pathogens, or at least having the effects be less dramatic. This is another reason for protecting big road-free areas. Next. And I'll end with a dream of mine, that is to see eventually the puma or the cougar, the mountain lion, the panther, same great cat, see that great cat restored to our region. If we really do our work well, I believe we could see in our lifetimes, or our children's lifetimes anyway, the return of the puma, but they probably cannot very easily come back on their own. We would probably need to consider, after much education and building support, we would probably need to consider active reintroduction, because their nearest populations are a long way away. South Florida and South Dakota's Black Hills. That's a long way, and it's usually the males that are the wide dispersers with pumas. So I think we should think about how to keep our lands connected so that animals can naturally recolonize, but we should also think about whether there may be some creatures that need active help from us. And a critical part of conservation, along with habitat connectivity, is coexistence. We need to learn to live with these wide-ranging animals and even welcome them. Thank you very much for your time. And if we have time, Mel, I think Michale and I would both be happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much. Those are both excellent talks. We've got two questions here. First is a comment: Split Rock Wildway Map, a large yellow, green, brown region is not on the key. But the first question is, can John comment on charismatic loons?
I love loons, and I think they're a good indicator of what they're very volatile. I wish Nina Schock were with us. She could give a much better explanation, but loons are sensitive to water pollution, mercury contamination particularly. So water quality is an urgent concern with loons. And thankfully, I believe, Michale, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe our loon population is relatively stable at present.
I believe that to be true also. I think it's kind of steady.
Next question: what was the organization you suggested visiting in the last 5 minutes? Was that Northern Forest Atlas?
Northern Forest Atlas Project, which is headed by Jerry Jenkins, and I also recommended the Old Growth Forest Network headed by Joan Maloof. So northernforestatlas.org, and then Old Growth Forest Network is, I forget, but if you just Google Old Growth Forest Network, you get there.
John, I had a question. As Michale was talking about the change in distribution that can occur in wildlife due to climate change, she was talking about that on a more specific, site-specific or area level. How does that increase the importance of connectivity and movement as our temperatures change?
Good question, David. And I should have said more about climate. I felt Michale had covered it pretty well, so I didn't say much about it. But climate change may force some animals to move northward or upward in elevation to track their climate envelopes. Sometimes when I'm talking with young people, I like to summarize why we need connectivity as food, sex, genes, cover, change. Of course, the sex gets them excited just to say the word, but what I mean is animals need to roam widely to find mates. The change part, animals may need to move northward or upward to track their climate envelope. Cover, animals need natural cover, and it's best if that's in a fairly continuous fashion. And food, many animals during the course of a year may need to be in one type of habitat at one time and another type of habitat at another time. The black bears, for instance, may want to be near wetlands in the spring, may want to be up in the high country to burrow into snow dens in the winter. So the habitat connections are important for all those reasons, and climate just makes that connections all the more important. Or climate chaos, I should say. Climate change, climate chaos.
Okay, we've got a few more questions in Q&A. First, Michale, is there any way to keep boreal birds in New York, or are they basically doomed?
Thanks for the easy question, Matt. I would say that they're not all doomed. I think some of the ones that, rusty blackbird, for example, that's been in a steep decline that started in the 70s, we might have a difficult time with that species, but the rates of decline are variable. Gray jay, Canada jay is kind of steady, and some of the declines that I'm seeing, I am seeing in the low elevation habitat, but I'm not working in high elevation boreal, and that was a decision we made at the beginning of the project because mountain bird watch already existed. And so we are focused just on low elevation, but some of the birds that we've been tracking, you know, the option of going up high is an option for them, like boreal chickadee, which my husband, who was a ranger for 25 years, would see in lots and lots of places. You know, three-toed woodpecker could be up high, yellow-bellied flycatcher could be up high. So there may be elevational options for some of these species that I'm just not catching because we're working in the low boreal. So that's one answer. I don't think they're all doomed. I think some of them are doing okay. And if others can figure out whatever it is that the palm warbler is doing, the palm warbler is doing great, and it has the same distribution as all the other ones. So I'm not sure exactly what that is, but hopefully we can understand a little bit more of that as we continue to look at the long-term trends. The other thing that I would say is just that when people ask me that question, I although it makes me really sad to think about losing some of these species, I think that you know, the idea of resilience, at least in the way that the Nature Conservancy talks about it, which is one of, I think, some of the best and most elegant science about this, is to think about the idea of maintaining, you know, the stage rather than the players, making sure we have you know, the Yankees as a team rather than the exact players that are on the team right now. And I think the same idea applies in these biological communities. And so one thing that I take heart in is that as I do see some decline in some of the birds that we've been tracking for years and years in my boreal wetlands, I am also seeing sandhill crane show up in those same places, which is a spectacular bird and unbelievably charismatic. And so, you know, it's sad, but I'm also heartened to see that, you know, new species are going to come in, and these wetlands will remain very, very important habitats for a suite of species, even if long-term we don't keep the same exact suite of species. And I'm really happy to see the crane in Bloomingdale Bog and Spring Pond Bog and places like that.
Okay, I'm going to combine a couple questions with this one. Advocates have been successful integrating connectivity into state plans such as Open Space and Wildlife Action Plan, but how can we better foster New York State implementation of wildlife connectivity conservation? And I'm going to combine that with Michale, in your work, have you ever come across a good conservation subdivision design that truly makes room for wildlife in the Adirondacks?
There are good examples of conservation subdivisions. I can't point to any here, and we don't, you know, have that many large subdivisions, thankfully, that, you know, that even get proposed in the Adirondacks very often. I think we're making slow progress in the Adirondacks, and we continue to try to work on that. But there's nothing that I would point to as you know, as spectacularly great. There have been some that have done some good things, but there are examples, and I'm not going to come up with the names of them off the top of my head, but there are examples from other systems, and they are systems that are different from ours. They are systems in which things like, you know, active agriculture has been a part of what they wanted to protect in those cases. But there are definitely models out there, and I think that would be one of the best things that could happen here in the park, actually, is if we had the chance to do a completely amazing model and to sort of point out how it could serve as a model for others as well. You know, I'm concerned as much in the park, not just about designing whole subdivisions, as thinking about what do we do about all of the individual developments that happen, which is far more of what we see in the park. How do you get around regulating that? And the state of Maine has actually done some neat stuff recently with thinking about, you know, sort of individual developments and how you tackle that problem. So there may be some models in Maine in particular that we could look to. I can't remember. I've already forgotten what the other part of the question was, and maybe it was one for John.
Well, I'll just quickly add, if we have a minute, more money. Always, we need more money for land conservation, including full fee purchase by land trusts and the state, and also acquisition of conservation easements. But equally important, we need strong incentives for good private land stewardship. None of these wildlife habitat connections will remain viable if we don't reward landowners for doing the right thing. But that may be in part through carbon programs, that pay landowners to keep their trees standing and to grow intact forests. But in general, we need to encourage private lands conservation as well as acquire critical lands for land trust or state holdings.
And Mel, before we sign off, I just want to thank Paul Smiths again. I want to thank you and Dan and all the work you've done, our panelists, all our participants, the Adirondack Council for sponsoring this webinar. And it was a wonderful session today. And as I approach almost 15 years on the Adirondack Research Consortium board, I just want to highlight the importance the Adirondack Research Consortium has for having these conversations about research and conversation and the connectivity between those two topics. And if you haven't already, please go to the Adirondack Research Consortium board. This is my commercial to give an annual gift, because your annual gifts help us do these types of programs and connect research and wildlife and conservation.
Thank you so much, Dave. We have several questions we didn't get to, so I will send those to Michale and John, and we can put the answers up on our Facebook site. A recording for today's talk will be available on our YouTube channel. All registrants will get links to both of those. I'd like to thank you all. Michale, John, David, this has been an excellent webinar. You kicked us off in the best way possible. Everyone, if you would please join us next week for Human Dimensions of Natural Resources. So thank you very much. You'll have a wonderful day, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye.
Thank you.